Hi, this is Rebecca Pohlmeyer with Set 6 of my book critiques for EDU 318. My feature text for this set is The Year of Miss Agnes by Kirkpatrick Hill. This is a multicultural, realistic fiction book with a reading level of 8 to 12 years. Miss Agnes is the new teacher for the small Athabascan village in Alaska, and the students that she's teaching have never had a teacher that really cares for them and cares for their best interests, especially when it comes to learning. So her students fall in love with learning when Miss Agnes ditches the textbooks and embraces more non-traditional methods of teaching, and most importantly shows them that she believes that they can succeed too. This is a Smithsonian Notable Book for Children, as well as the winner of several other awards. My first lesson for the Year of Miss Agnes is a culture study, which aligns with North Carolina 5th grade social studies standards, which talks about the relationships between European explorers and Native American groups. In this lesson, students will use critical thinking to formulate questions and engage in a virtual field trip to the Alaska Native Heritage Center. Students will communicate with peers after their experience to discuss and reflect on their own responses to different cultures. Students will create a creative and original blog post to communicate their reflections with the class as well as with a wide audience. So this is the Alaska Native Heritage Center, which looks like an amazing place to visit. Unfortunately, I've never been because it is located in Alaska. So unless your students are in Alaska, this isn't somewhere they could actually visit. But luckily, the Alaska Native Heritage Center has recently started offering virtual school visits and presentations. So students would attend this virtual field trip, and then they would reflect on some questions that I've posed on a class blog. So the teacher would create the class blog, and then the students would be able to leave a reply or a comment answering those questions that the teacher created. My second lesson is communicating about communication. I used an ISTE standard for this, which talks about how students will be able to curate information from digital resources and then create collections of artifacts that demonstrate their connections or conclusions. This is a 5th grade lesson, and in the lesson, students will discuss how there are many different forms of communication, and this is a common theme throughout the book, The Year of Miss Agnes. Students will use a critical thinking to identify the various ways people can communicate, and will take an online sign language class for beginners. One of the characters in The Year of Miss Agnes is deaf, and so she learns how to communicate by using sign language. Students will be able to do the same thing here. After this, students will collaborate with peers to formulate open-ended questions and interview people around their school and community about their thoughts on communication. The students then will communicate their learning and interview responses in a creative video. So here is an example of one simple online sign language course. This is from signlanguage101.com. And then students will move on to the interview and video portion. So when doing this, students should focus on interviewing people who speak different languages and come from different cultures. Interview questions can include, what are some things that are important to do when you communicate with someone? Why is it important to communicate? Do you have any favorite memories of a time you were able to communicate with someone? And what are some ways that you communicate besides speaking? Students will video these responses or record them, just the audio, and then create a video using either iMovie or Adobe Spark. Moving on to the rest of the books I read this week, I read From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by E.L. Konigsburg. This is a realistic fiction book which tells the tale of a brother and sister as they run away from home. This isn't your average runaway story, though, because these siblings stay for a week in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there they find a little bit of a mystery surrounding one of the art pieces. Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lin is traditional literature inspired by Chinese folklore, and it tells the story of a little girl in her quest to find the old man in the moon, to ask her how her family can become rich. Inch by Inch is a Caldecott-winning picture book by Lionni, where an inchworm makes friends with other animals in nature, and he measures things that are important to them. And finally, Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears by Verna Aardema is another traditional literature, this time a picture book. that tells the amusing African legend of how a mosquito sets off a chain of unfortunate events which culminates in him eternally buzzing in people's ears. To end with a quote from the Year of Miss Agnes. Just because he lived in a village all his life didn't mean he couldn't become a scientist or anything else, she said. So this quote is talking about how the students never realized that they could become anything outside of their village. And Miss Agnes awakened that excitement and that sense of adventure in them. But most importantly, she challenged them to become who they were. If a child wanted to stay in the village and raise a family, she supported that. But she also supported if a student wanted to go outside the village and become something like a scientist. So I really like this quote, especially as a future educator, reminding myself that I need to be inspiring my students to be who they were meant to be, not who I want them to be. Thanks so much for listening.